was elected to the Florida House 6 years ago, and I am a small business owner in the healthcare sector, and I would have been so intimidated to be in this room 6 years ago because my background is not at all in water policy. But after being elected and living in Martin County, I quickly realized it would become my world, and I would be talking about it every day. Luckily, I've had some wonderful people, many of them here on the panel, that have helped me out quite a bit over the years. I've always tried to seek those scientifically based solutions, and I think that's what we need to continue to do. We've got a great panel for you. Here, let me tell you a little bit about them. We have Temperance Morgan with TNC. She's going to be starting out with a big picture about necessary work to be done in the northern Everglades. We have Ernie Marks, Martin County. He'll explain what the management district is doing around Lake Okeechobee. The other Ernie Barnett, who has just been great for me to pick his brains over the years, and I truly wanted to tell you and everyone else that I appreciate all you've done for me personally. And he's been working on these projects for over 30 years, and he's going to talk about the role of private landowners. Next, we'll have Everglades restoration and funding for it with our DEP Secretary, Drew Bartlett. And finally, every good panel needs a good lawyer. So we've got Greg Munson. He's going to discuss the topic of using wells, the controversial topic of using wells, and I'll be paying attention to that quite closely. Last week, when I had to interview with our local paper, and the question's like, well, so what have you guys been doing for all these years? What's happening? We're still having discharges. We're still having algae. We're still not restoring the Everglades. What's going on? And I always talk about these three important things that are happening and are close to completing. When you're first elected and you're voting for these great projects, I know that I will not in office see the completion of those projects, but they've been so important. Number one being the bridging or the raising of the Tamiami Trail to let water flow into the Everglades, cleaning and storing water in the C-44 and C-43 canal, as well as projects like in my backyard, Calkins Water Farm. I hope someone will speak a little bit about that as well. And also putting those curves back in this Kissimmee, because that's where it all starts, so that we can restore northern and southern Everglades. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Temperance and get started here.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to have the opportunity to kick off this panel on Everglades restoration. I guess I'm going to apologize by saying I think some of what I'm going to say is going to seem a bit repetitive from some of the speakers that have come up this morning. But I think there's good news in that, and that there's a common theme and I think a common message that wasn't coordinated, but that I think you're going to hear come out through the presentation. So unfortunately, as you heard on the first panel, we continue to be confronted with ecological crises in the Everglades and the estuaries. And every time these situations happen, which is more often than we'd like, we all start searching for immediate solutions and someone to blame. So you've heard the blame game language mentioned multiple times this morning. But the unfortunate reality, the harsh reality we must accept, is that there are no quick fixes and short-term solutions. There's no silver bullet. And frankly, we're all accountable. And one of the other things that I'd like to remind us all of before I jump into the rest of my talk is a concept that was really important to the passage of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan in 2000, and that concept or principle is shared adversity. And the idea behind it is these projects are going to take us a really long time to build, and in the meantime, we're going to have impacts. And we're not going to enjoy that, but we have to find ways to balance those impacts and share that adversity across the system as best we can until we get all the fixes in place. So I'd like for us to keep that concept in mind as we all talk this morning. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about interim options. I'm not going to call them solutions because in my mind they're not. They're interim options. We have long-term solutions that we need to diligently focus on implementing, and I want to spend some time talking about the role that we all do play and can play in Everglades restoration. So while it is most definitely the long-term fixes, I said there's no short-term solutions that are going to be necessary to restore and recover this system. There are some actions that we can take in the interim, some interim options or actions that can help provide some relief, particularly to our estuaries and to the economies that those estuaries sustain. And one of the fastest ways we can provide the relief to this system with the infrastructure we have in place now is operational flexibility. So this involves the Water Management District and the Army Corps of Engineers being creative and finding every operational option to try to move the water south instead of to the estuaries. The reality is they are indeed doing this. They are making every effort to try to come up with emergency operations to move water south, but there are a lot of limitations and constraints, many of which are legal, water quality, threatened and endangered species, regulations, schedules, et cetera, that limit that option. So with that said, I think we absolutely have to maximize it because it is the bird in the hand, but we have to recognize that it can't solve all of these problems. Another really important short-term option that we at the Nature Conservancy have been focusing on is expediting rehabilitation of Herbert Hoover Dike, and in collaboration with that, working to adopt a new schedule for Lake Okeechobee that will allow us in the interim, because we do believe that in the interim there is some more storage capacity in the lake that we can use as a short-term option in this mindset of shared adversity to try to help reduce some of those discharges that we would otherwise be sending to the estuary. So if we can get that dike repaired and look to adopt a new and flexible schedule, we believe that can provide us some interim relief as well. Two other big opportunities for interim relief are the Dispersed Water Management Program, which Ernie Barnett's going to spend some time talking about, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, but to quickly introduce it as an option, and one which basically involves retaining or storing water on public and private lands, usually fairly shallow storage. And this is an option that we think is very viable and in certain instances can be a very cost-effective option and also provide other ancillary benefits like water quality treatment and habitat benefits. So that's a tool the district's already implementing that can help us again in the short term. Another option that's under evaluation, the Water Management District, and Ernie can speak to all this, I don't want to steal his thunder, but is deep well injection. So this is a concept that the Water Management District is currently evaluating the technical feasibility of. And from the Nature Conservancy standpoint, I would say, if indeed deep well injection is determined to be economically and technically feasible and is used at times, only at times when we would otherwise be sending that water to the estuaries and causing harm, then that may be a very viable tool that we should also have in our short-term toolbox. But if we really want to restore the Everglades, we're back to long-term solutions, and we can't lose sight on those. The Everglades, I would like to remind you, represents a third of the landmass of our state, almost half of the population, and a huge portion of our economy. So frankly, it's not an option, I don't think. We have to figure this out. And that means we have to focus on comprehensive water quality and water quantity solutions that are going to take a long time and cost a lot of money. But we have to stay focused. We cannot lose sight in staying focused on implementing those solutions. And projects, some of which were already mentioned by the representative, projects like the C43 reservoir along the Caloosahatchee, or the C44 reservoir along the St. Lucie, which are both under construction. We've got to continue to push those projects forward. Other key projects that are in the planning pipeline right now, the EAA reservoir, so another storage reservoir within the Everglades agricultural area, or the Lake Okeechobee watershed project, which is some features north of the lake. Those four projects are essential to moving forward Everglades restoration, and so they're currently in stages of either construction or planning, and we need to continue to move those forward. There's a document called the Integrated Delivery Schedule, and that document was developed by the federal and state governments along with all of the Everglades stakeholders, and it is in essence a sequence of all the federal and state projects that we're aware of that are in the pipeline, and that sequence is based on funding limitations and good science. So they've thought about all the projects and what's the order in which we should implement those projects to get the biggest bang with the least amount of need for shared adversity. So the concept is great. It's a schedule that was just revisited and updated this summer, but unfortunately, some of those schedules are slipping. So that schedule identified what we're gonna do by 2030, and we're starting to see projects in there that are starting to slip, which is very troubling. Recently, there have been significant cuts in federal funding for Everglades restoration. So since 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers had $126 million to put towards this partnership. In 2019, they're expecting to receive $68 million. So that's basically half of the amount of money that they had annually in 2016 to put towards those projects. In that same amount of time, the state has stepped up and more than doubled our funding. And I think Drew's going to spend some time, digging into this. But we need both state and federal funding to continue to progress and to stay on schedule, or we're going to find these long-term solutions are dragging out by decades, and we're going to continue to see years like we saw this year. So we have got to stay focused on keeping that funding and those projects moving forward. As I said, the good news is some of them are already moving, and frankly, within 2-3 years, we're going to start to see some of the benefits from C-43, C-44. But we've got to stay the course, and I believe, the Nature Conservancy believes, that there are probably projects in addition to those that are already in the integrated delivery schedule, particularly for the northern Everglades, particularly north of Lake Okeechobee, that we're going to need to identify and integrate into that integrated delivery schedule. So we've got to stay focused on implementing the projects in that schedule and identifying any other projects that we need to really achieve our long-term vision. So up to this point, I've spent my time talking about the state and the federal government and what projects they need to build and what operations they need to implement. But I'd like to talk now a little bit about our role. And by our role, I don't mean just the Nature Conservancies. I mean the collective us, the we, all of us, and the role we all play in both the problems and can play in the solutions. And you've heard some of this mentioned this morning. But the reality is tragedy breeds anger, and anger breeds the desire for accountability. And that's whether you're talking about algal blooms or any other travesty we see in our country. That's just the phenomenon that we see. And we've seen it year after year in the Everglades. So the exercise of the blame game and finger pointing. And the fact is we all bear responsibility for these tragedies. We cannot simply blame government agencies for not doing enough or not doing it fast enough. We can't blame the agricultural or the mining industries for being the sole source of our problems. They have a role to play, but so do we. So we have to acknowledge our own personal responsibility. And this came up earlier in some of the presentations, and I find these statistics to be a little troubling in light of the issues we're here talking about this morning. Do you fertilize your lawn? Most of us do. As a matter of fact, more Floridians fertilize their lawns than any other place in the U.S. besides California, Illinois, and Texas. So just having these problems that we're having and the investments we're making, we continue to fertilize our lawns at a very high rate. Do you have a septic system? Well, 30% of those of us who live in Florida do, and we know those have an impact on the issues we're here talking about. Do you water your landscaping? Why, yes, we do. Floridians consume more water for landscape irrigation than for any other water use in the state. More than for our consumptive use, our drinking water, more than agriculture uses. We're putting more water on our lawns. So I would ask, would we rather have lush lawns, or would we rather have a healthy Everglades and healthy springs and lakes and estuaries and a healthy economy? Because I certainly would argue for the latter. And again, the good news is if we're part of the problem, we can be part of the solution. We can stop the finger pointing. We can think of ways we can improve our own personal habits. And they may seem small, but cumulatively, those differences can have an impact. Frankly, it's cumulatively that those things are causing the impacts they're causing already. And we need to express the importance of these issues. You've heard a lot of talk this morning about how water gets thrown to the bottom of the priority list when times get tough. We have got to all collectively continue to push for funding for these projects and keep these schedules on track. I'd like to close with an African proverb that I'm fond of and I think is really applicable to this topic this morning. And that proverb is, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And the reality is we can't go quickly. These projects cannot be built overnight, but we definitely have a very long way to go. So I think we'll be served much better by going together. So thank you.
Good morning. Holy moly. I'd like to thank the Academy. I appreciate AIF for having us here today and the invite that I received. I would also like to, and I swear to God this is not a comedy sketch, but I would like to thank Gaylord Palms because as I sat out in the audience and I looked at the acoustic stuff we had hanging on the wall and back, it reminded me that I have to go home and change the air filter in my air conditioner. So thank you very much for that. And probably most of all, welcome to the South Florida Water Management District. If you didn't know it, you are in it, and you're right down the street from the headwaters of the Everglades, which is Shingle Creek. So appreciate you all being here today, and I hope that you all took advantage of the water that you had in your hotel rooms and the water that you were drinking, and it's our staff and the local municipalities and the utilities that make that all possible. So don't underestimate all of the effort that goes into that, and I think you'll hear a lot more of it from some of the panel speakers today. I think I have a presentation. I've got a map here that I'm not going to spend too much time on, and you can't see it very well from where you are, which is why I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But there's been a lot of discussion about what is being done. I think you hear a lot in the newspapers, a lot in the media, that we're not doing anything. We haven't heard of anything moving forward. We need to find, as Ms. Morgan stated, somebody to blame. And I'm here to tell you today that despite all of the rhetoric and all of the items you hear about in the newspaper, there is plenty being done. The state of Florida and the South Florida Water Management District, just in water quality alone, south of the lake, when we were done with restoration strategies, will have spent $3.6 billion on water quality. We've spent another $2 million on implementation of SERP. So I know Mr. Bartlett will talk a little bit more about the funds expended by the state and the feds and the details on that a little later on, but I wanted to dispel the myth that nothing is going on. You had mentioned water and the priority it is on lists that we've seen in prior presentations and in your presentation. Water is at the top of my priority list. I run an agency that protects 8.1 million people. I run a flood control system, and that flood control system also doubles as a water supply for the 8.1 million people that live in South Florida. And so that's what I live every day in the decisions that we make and the use of ad valorem dollars, state dollars, and the efforts and resources that we put forward. You may have also heard that we have this giant restoration program called Everglades Restoration. That is also at the top of my list and is also one of the things that I spend an enormous amount of time with my staff of engineers and scientists trying to move forward at the speed of light with the resources that we have. I will tell you that for the state's part, we're receiving over $200 million a year to move this forward. That's not a small amount of money. It's also not enough. We have a federal partner that we know we need to bring along, and as Ms. Morgan mentioned, and I'm sure Mr. Bartlett will talk about later, they've had some difficulty, but it's going to take consistent funding in order to keep us moving down that path. But if you look at the map, again, draw your eyes back to that, these are projects that are either planned and ready for funding, projects that are in design and ready to move forward, or they are projects that are under construction. A lot of you have heard about the C44 reservoir and STA, stormwater treatment area, the C43 reservoir on the West Coast. By the way, someone mentioned a $500 million plan or $500 million being available at the end of a legislative session, I could take that for that one project alone. So there is plenty of going on, there's plenty of need down here, and there's plenty we can do, especially when we know that our state is growing at the pace that it's growing today. All of these projects help us direct not only quality, but quantity and timing of distribution of those flows. You have to send the flows to the right place, it's got to be clean, and you got to do it at the right time. And so for us, it's a little more involved than I think the newspapers and the scuttlebutt on the street let on, but I wanted to let you know that I have an amazing group of folks that work at our agency with DEP, with FDACS, with the Corps of Engineers, and we are all concentrating on doing what we can to ensure we move it forward as quickly as possible. Now, this was titled Next Steps, so where do we focus? Well, I'll tell you where my focus is right now, and that's north of Lake Okeechobee. If you saw the map that I had presented before, you saw that there was an enormous amount of activity going on south of Lake Okeechobee. Not to say that there isn't more to do, but we have concentrated our efforts in that particular region of the state. This ecosystem starts right down the street from here at Shingle Creek and goes all the way out to the Florida Keys. We cannot bisect an ecosystem and expect to have it function the way, or as close to the way as it would function naturally, or to meet the needs of the people that live here. So from my standpoint, when we're looking at where we invest resources going forward, keeping all of those other things on track, the EAA reservoir, C43, C44, we've got those plans, the Central Everglades project, all of those plans need to move forward, but we need to redirect our focus north of the lake. Someone mentioned the swim plan before. I think it was Frank in his presentation. In 2000, the Florida legislature developed the Lake Okeechobee Protection Act. In 2007, they doubled down and did the Northern Estuaries and Everglades Protection Plan. There is a need for about 1.3 or 900 to 1.3 million acre feet of storage north of the lake. We have not advanced very many projects in that area. Mr. Barnett will talk to you about some of the landholder, the private landholder impacts and efforts that we have going on with them, which, as Ms. Morgan mentioned, are kind of those interim steps. We still need to continue to focus on the long-term steps to have the infrastructure in place so that when we can connect the two systems together, both north of the lake and south of the lake, and get them to function like they need to in order for us to sustain the culture and the lifestyle that everybody down here has become accustomed to. And then again, when we were talking about algae, and this is just another companion map to the one you saw before, we were talking about algae and the impacts of nitrogen on it. Again, if there's anything you take home from these two slides, I would like you to look at all of the flow entering the system and where it comes from. 95% of the flow that comes into our system comes from north of Lake Okeechobee. 95% of the flow. The rest is rainfall to the south, but 95% that come into the lake and move throughout the system to the estuaries, all the impacts you hear about in the newspapers, to the impacts to the lake, 95% of the flow coming into Lake Okeechobee comes from the north. And then when you look at the basins and you look at under the storm conditions where we have to discharge from Lake Okeechobee, you're looking at about roughly 30% of the flow under those storm conditions coming from Lake Okeechobee, the majority, up to 70% of the discharges coming from the basins into those rivers. We have a lot to do. We cannot remain solely focused south of the lake. We need to continue the good work that we're doing there. We need to move that forward, but we also need to make sure we focus on those other areas north of the lake and in the estuaries and work with the local governments and our federal and state partners to move that forward. So I'll leave you with that. What I always tell folks when we're talking about Lake Okeechobee is I treat it like a four-way intersection. If I come up to a four-way intersection, I don't wait to step on the brakes until after I get through the intersection. I stop beforehand. And stopping the water, treating the water before it enters the lake doesn't write off Lake Okeechobee. It recognizes the ecological impacts and the needs of Lake Okeechobee. It recognizes the ecological impacts and the needs of the estuaries and allows us to better manage our system for the 8.1 million people and others that are coming, we know are coming, to South Florida in the future. So I'd like to leave you, Chairman Albritton mentioned at the outset of his presentation that we need to focus on the truth, and I can't say it any better than he did, but I encourage everybody who has an interest or has questions. The Water Management District is always open to provide that information. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have YouTube site, but more importantly, we have a phone number. So if you have a question, pick up the phone, give us a call. Be happy to work with you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here, as everyone else has said, and I genuinely want to thank AIF for allowing me to be on a panel with 5 people that I'm sincerely and deeply hold in great esteem and high regard, and had the good fortune of, for each and every one of my co-panelists, having spent time in the trenches with them, both at DEP and at the Water Management District. And I will tell you that Everglades restoration would not be where it is today without the hard work of these fine people. And I'm going to get mushy. I'm just deeply, deeply moved by being here with them. I did work for government for 30 years. I sort of fondly look back at that time. It's some of the best time of my life. In bad days, I kind of thought of it as my Shawshank years, but as I've crawled out of the tunnel and now I'm sitting on the beach, I can look back and it was really wonderful times, got a lot done. I'm equally excited about what I do now. And after 30 years of government, I worked with lots of people, many stakeholders, were engaged in Everglades restoration, had the opportunity to work with landowners, as each and every one of these people continue to do today. And I found the landowners to be just phenomenal stewards of the environment, especially the multi-generational farmers. They knew where every drop of water on their property goes. They want to leave the land better than they got it from their parents for their children. And I now work for the Florida Land Council. And I think what you'll hear is the role of the private landowner is really integral in the success of Everglades restoration. I'm going to talk quickly about 2 key areas that I think we can continue to be excellent stewards and partners in. First, you have to understand the landscape. As Mr. Marks mentioned, 95% of the water that flows into Lake Okeechobee comes from the north. That landscape is a lot of cow-calf, open pasture, not a lot of high-intensity development on the southern end, but on the northern end, as he mentioned, you're also in the headwaters of the Everglades restoration. But from an ag perspective, it's a lot of not necessarily intense agriculture, but it's agriculture that had for decades been not regulated. There's a lot of legacy phosphorus that is built up in the soil. You used to have a lot of free-roaming cattle. Those cows do what they do well. Left a lot of nutrients behind in the soils. But going forward, we've implemented these things called best management practices. They really are source controls. They're at the farm level. What can you do from a farming practice that can help keep nutrients out of the natural environment and used only for agricultural purposes? A lot of things like actually putting water control structures, building above ground impoundments where you can actually hold the water back, and then also use that same water in your ag irrigation practices, lessening the demand on the regional system. And you can use these tailwater recovery systems. And in this example, even fencing to keep cattle and wildlife out of the water and their ability to keep from having nutrients enter into the system. Also, very much more technology, much more sophisticated farming practices where you can do observation wells, weather stations, so you can better irrigate, soil moisture probes where you only apply water when absolutely necessary. These are all highly sophisticated, highly evolved farming practices that have been integrated into the landscape. Kind of want to share one case study south of Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades BMP program, kind of an amazing success story When I first started working on Everglades restoration, there wasn't even litigation yet. That led to a lawsuit in 1988 where the federal government actually sued the state of Florida. Yeah, it was that long ago. Kissimmee River had been dredged already, though, so I'm not that old. But if you look at this map, the one on the right shows each dot is where the numeric nutrient standard, which was later adopted at 10 parts per billion, is exceeded. Every red dot is exceeded, the green dot's where it was achieved. The bigger the dot, the higher the over 10 parts per billion it is. And so this is how much phosphorus concentration in the system was, entering the system was averaging about 175 parts per billion. We had to get it down to a flow-weighted mean of 13, or effectively 10 parts per billion. So all of that red had to be removed from the system. Through a cooperative and collaborative approach between government and landowners, the farmers implemented BMPs on their lands. The Water Management District, regulated by DEP, built these large regional stormwater treatment systems. Ruh-roh. Perfect. And then ultimately, the water flows into the Everglades, ultimately very clean and so forth. So what kind of BMPs were done? Each landowner within that 500,000 acre area had to implement comprehensive BMP plans with nutrient management, water management, sediment control, and those things at the on-the-ground farm level. Data was collected to establish the precondition, and then and to date, because of that hard work, over 3,700 tons of phosphorus have been removed at the farm level, an additional 1,600 tons through the STAs. You may ask, why did the farmers remove more than the STAs? It's simple. The higher numbers are easy to remove. It's like being on a diet. The first few pounds you lose are easier than the last few. The STAs are having to get very low phosphorus levels even lower, and they've done an amazing job, and that's a testament to these folks sitting at the table. So where are we now? Remember that map? The existing condition? Here's where we are today. All of that red, we're knocking on the precipice of actually achieving the 10 part per billion standard. And then look at where we are in the Everglades. And I would argue, and I think I could defend my arguments, wherever you have an exceedance, one of the few remaining red dots, it's because of the legacy phosphorus that had built up in the soil over the decades of the discharges, and not related to the current discharges. So I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the second part we can do. That was more regulatory. This is cooperative. Case studies of actually where landowners fit into the restoration. Temperance and Ernie both talked about the Northern Everglades program, working in the landscape. One concept that's now a full-fledged implemented program is how can we engage landowners to go above and beyond what's required to hold water back on their property and then receive a services payment for that benefit that's a public purpose. And these are simple things like removing drainage ditches, putting boards, building some small berms instead of the water rapidly draining off the landscape, holding it on the property. There's a lot of economic benefit. You keep the land on the tax rolls. An earlier speaker talked about that. Sustains jobs, but also accomplishes this public purpose. And to date, over 90,000 acre feet of storage have now been put in place. And Representative Magar had also mentioned Calkins. There's some key projects that are already funded by the legislature. We're working through the final contracting and permitting issues with the Water Management District. And there's another 200,000 acre feet of water within the Northern Everglades watershed that should within the next year all be going online. So the next time we have one of these high flow events with millions of acre feet rushing into Lake Okeechobee, that 95% that Mr. Marks talked about, if we could hold back 200,000 acre feet from entering into the estuaries, it'll stave off, hopefully, the proliferation of the blue-green algae you heard about earlier, the health of the estuaries. These are not the end-all solution. You still have to build the other projects. You have to implement the government works. And I'm going to close with that. UF did a study in 2014. They identified 5 things you needed to do to stop the lake releases and improve the Everglades. And I think the recurring theme you're hearing from all of us is we've got to finish the projects that have been authorized, the C-44, the C-43, the Kissimmee River restoration, the Broward WP water preserve areas, restoration strategies, the water quality work. Capture, store, and treat water north of Lake Okeechobee. That 95%, if we can hold it back, you can do it through the dispersed water management, but also through the Lake Okeechobee watershed plan that the Water Management District and the Corps are currently developing. Provide additional storage south of the lake. We can check that box off with Senate Bill 10 that was passed, and the reservoir that the Water Management District, who moved mountains to formulate a reservoir to have additional storage south of Lake Okeechobee. That is now pending congressional authorization and hopefully will in the WRDA bill. I think Mr. Munson may talk on the next one, but you have recognized use other technologies. Capture that water, pump it down into the boulder zone safely where it can be disposed of and not cause harm. And then lastly, where can we take advantage of some small incremental additional storage within Lake Okeechobee once the rehabilitation is in place? And with that, I think we do those things, and I think in our lifetime, some of us are closer to the end of our lifetime than some of the other younger people on the panel, but even in my lifetime, I think we can see an end of these discharges and hopefully put a big dent in the algal blooms that you see in the estuaries. Thank you.
Good morning. Good to see everyone again. I was reflecting this morning when I woke up about all the familiar faces that I've seen here, in the past times I've been here and this time. And the one thing that struck me is how many of my former direct supervisors have attended this conference this time. We have Jeff Littlejohn, Herschel Vineyard, Cliff Wilson, I don't have my glasses on, John Steverson, Ryan Matthews, and Noah Valenstein. That's a lot of direct bosses. So I'm going to have a performance evaluation after this. And Jeff, I'm still getting threes, wherever you are. There you are. But before I get into the funding, I just wanted to reflect upon what we've accomplished since 2010. And I think it really started early on in Governor Scott's administration when Herschel Vineyard, and I think Greg Munson, you had something to do with this, and Melissa Meeker and Governor Scott sat down and figured out how to stop fighting in court constantly over Everglades restoration. And when restoration strategies was inked and everybody sang kumbaya and went to Judge Gold and Judge Moreno and said, this is what we're going to do, things got done. And what you can see as a result, Ernie hit on it a lot, but we're seeing the best water quality in the Everglades on record as we sit here right now. 91% of the Everglades is meeting standards. We used to have 20 impacted stations. We're down to 13 impacted water quality stations. The investment is paying off. So we're seeing that happen. Since 2010, we've finished 26 of the 32 projects that are under construction. Finishing the projects, not just starting them. And so it is happening, and maintaining that focus, not filing lawsuits every other day, works. It gets it done. So one of the other things, well, that's a new device. There it is. One of the other things.
I think we got presentations mixed up.
Yeah, that's not my presentation. But I can give it if you'd like.
You'd probably do a better job.
No. Did you get it?
That one on your performance.
That's right. So anyway, while they're working on that, the other thing we accomplished, it was 3-4 years ago during Governor Scott's second term, was he advocated for, and we passed dedicated funding for Everglades. That's the first time that's ever happened. And now we have a reliable funding stream, as long as the lawsuit doesn't undo that, to fund Everglades restoration. So let's look at that funding stream. So this is what we call Legacy Florida, and this is how the funding gets directed towards Everglades restoration. So you can see it started in 2017, and it's basically a % of dock stamps, basically a % of the Amendment 1 funds, or a minimum amount, a flat minimum amount that goes to Everglades restoration. And it starts, it started in 2017, a little bit less than 200, and it's ticking up as the economy rebounds until we get to that threshold of $264 million going towards Everglades restoration. Restoration strategies at the state gets fully funded by 2024, and so that gets converted to SERP and NEEP, and that's basically Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program and Northern Everglades programs. Until we get to 2027, and then it's just all goes towards SERP and NEEP. It's a minimum of $264 million. That just hasn't been seen before. That's the kind of funding you need for so many infrastructure projects. We can talk about that with Everglades restoration, septic to sewer, stormwater, alternative water supply. To keep this state and to get where we want to go, this dedicated funding is critical. We see it at the state level. We do not see it at the federal level. And so I urge everyone here to think about, when you're talking to people that influence federal decisions, what do we ask? First, we ask authorize WRDA more frequently, authorize Water Resource Development Act more frequently, starting with the one that's before the Senate right now, so we can get these projects rolling. And second, get your funding up. This year they were appropriated $77 million to the Corps of Engineers for SERP, and that's not moving the needle. We put together a slide that compares what we're asking for the feds to do, to dedicate $200 million a year, compared to what they did this year. And if you look at the time frame, and this is all the projects centrally located that deal with what we're facing right now, which fortunately is stopping soon, which these damaging estuarine discharges out of Lake Okeechobee and the local basins. And so what you see here is, of course, the state took on the C-43 reservoir. There's no change in schedule there. But when you move into the other projects where we're starting to see cost share funding, when you look at when we'll see these projects done, if the feds were at $200 million a year, it's in our lifetime. If they were not at $200 million a year, it's not. If they continue funding at $76, $77 million a year, that doesn't work out so well for us. So that's what needs to happen. That's what we're pushing for. When I threw this slide up, how many people said "Go Gators" in their head? Right? That was the unfortunate part, because I do not care for that team so much. But that is a default PowerPoint color, and so I will switch it to the key team that I do care about and leave you with that. All right, thank you very much. That's the funding. Greg, you're up.
Well, I also want to thank AIF for the opportunity to speak today, and the H2O Coalition, which is one of their entities that stays focused on water year-round. In addition to this conference once a year, this is something that AIF looks at every other week, actually, at least, on our regular conference calls. So I'm appreciative of both AIF and the H2O Coalition. They know me well here. Before I even stood up, they said, "You're out of time." So I will be very short. But in addition to being grateful to AIF, I'm also kind of grateful to Ernie Marks. Usually, I hear people referring to my speech afterwards as the comments from the bald guy, and I'm not going to have to listen to that this year because I got Ernie. So I just want to talk, and I'll go into as little depth as possible. But one of the things that you've heard from some of our speakers has to do with injecting water underground. Both as a way to simply dispose of it or as a long-term storage option. This is a technology that's been around in Florida for decades. It's been safely used for decades, and we're just starting to hear a drumbeat that it's not safe. And I wanted to go through, from a legal perspective, all of the regulations that are out there that show why you can trust this technology. But that drumbeat, my prediction, is going to continue. And by the time we're actually looking at putting these wells in, many of you are going to be hearing complaints, and Representative Magar, I include you in that as well. You're going to be hearing these complaints that it's not safe. So I'm sort of hopeful that as I go through some of these regulations, and don't worry, I'm not going to read the Florida Administrative Code to you, you'll have at least a few points to know that these are highly regulated and very safe. There's two basic kinds. Two basic kinds. There we go. That's, by the way, that's what it looks like above the ground. If you're wondering what a deep well injection looks like, this is what it looks like. And that is a schematic, and there's actually, I'm not going to go into the details there, but I'm showing you the two different kinds of wells. You'll see on the ones on the staged left side, they're a very deep well, and that's a deep well injection, and you can see that goes very deep below the surface, usually 10,000 feet, up to 10,000 feet below the surface. Miami-Dade's going even deeper than that right now. They're exploring that option. And then next to it is a shallower well, which is aquifer storage and recovery, which is a place where instead of just injecting it and getting rid of it, which is what the deeper well does, the aquifer storage and recovery is where you can inject it and then pull it out when you need it. So those are the two kinds that I'm going to talk about. The deeper well injection, which is just the disposal approach, the entire goal of the regulation is to protect the underground sources of drinking water that it's injected below. And it's typically injected into what's called the boulder zone. And all of the tests in the regulations that are required are geared to make sure that nothing that gets sent into that deep well injection contaminates the boulder zone. So I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by that. There's a construction and testing phase before you can start sending things down that well, just to make sure it's going to operate. The operators who do it, they have to have a particular staff with particular training. They do a thorough, before it begins operating, a thorough evaluation of the underground environment that includes a test to make sure there's no fluid migration into the underground source of drinking water. They test that confining zone that it's in to make sure it maintains confinement. They have operational requirements to make sure that when they start injecting things in there, it doesn't create fractures in the boulder zone that can lead to the underground source of drinking water. And then on top of that, they have monitoring wells that go in nearby to make sure that if there is any problem, it's immediately detected. So it's a very thorough regulatory system, and it's handled, by the way, out of Florida DEP. They have a whole section dedicated to this, the underground injection control system and regulations, to reviewing these applications and making sure that they're appropriately regulated. So that's the deep well injection. I'll hit the what's known as ASR, aquifer storage and recovery. The key thing I want you to remember about these types of wells, they're shallower, is that under 62-528, it's the state regulations, the quality of the injected water must meet primary and secondary drinking water quality standards. What are those? Well, your primary drinking water standards are the main things that protect public health, and I've given you a snapshot here on the screen, and Class 5 is just another name for this sort of well, of some of the drinking water regulations, and you probably can't make it out. But it starts with A, and you've got 6 or 7 of those, and it hasn't even gotten through all the chemicals that begin with A. I mean, there's hundreds of these things. So when we talk about your primary drinking water standards, there's a lot of them. Similarly, it also has to protect your secondary drinking water standards, and there's only a few of these. Some of them go towards public health. People tend to think of them more as aesthetics, color, odor, and those sorts of things, and those are also protected. They have to meet the DEP groundwater quality requirements at the point they're discharged into the ground, of course. And just like with the other types of wells, and I won't go through all of these, there's rules governing the testing, the operation of these, and monitoring. So again, with the goal of making sure that underground sources of, also making sure that underground sources of drinking water aren't affected. So again, I just wanted to give you that little bit of a teaser on the regulations because I think you're going to hear more about this. As South Florida Water Management District has been looking at ways, relatively cheap and relatively inexpensive ways to get rid of all these excess flows, they've looked at deep water injection and they're starting to get complaints about, oh, it's not safe. Well, it's been around for decades. It's never had a problem before. So before we sort of throw away a potentially inexpensive and workable option, I'm just trying to fill a little bit of that vacuum with some information about how it's regulated. My last point, I know I'm out of time, but I have a question, and I want to know the answer to this. So this is complete change of subject, but they said next steps in Everglades, and so I want an answer. I'm not a scientist. Sea level rise is beyond my expertise. I'm not here to talk to you about the rate of it, what the causes are, or anything else. I'm taking government predictions, which you see here, that produce a certain amount of sea level rise. Sorry, I know it's a complete change of subject, but I'm out of time, and I've got to kind of move here. Over the next 50 to 100 years, And you can see the amounts there. And roughly, for those of you who can't really see the slides, it's not real clear. These are government predictions that have been adapted by the South Florida counties in a Unified Sea Level Rise Projection Compact that basically says you're going to get about 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 2060, and 5 feet by 2100 if you use the middle lines, which is what they recommend for long-term infrastructure. So then you can go to a website that will show you what regions of the country will look like with sea level rise. So the blue area down there is what the Everglades looks like with 2 feet of sea level rise. And all that blue area down at the bottom is the part that used to be the Everglades. And then this is what it looks like with 5 feet of sea level rise. All that blue area is now underwater, inundated. So it's just a question. We're sort of sitting here talking about all this restoration we're going to do, and the timelines are going out 30 or 40 years. Well, in 30 or 40 years, there's going to be a lot of this underwater. What's the plan for that? And I don't understand that. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. I'm sure smarter people than me are thinking about that, but I thought it would be a good question in the next steps in Everglades restoration to end with. And with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much.
Just want to thank the panel once again and my AIF friends for having me here and all of us here today. I think the takeaway for me is that we need to stay the course and we need to work together. We've got a whole new cabinet and governor coming in. You've got a whole lot of new legislators coming in. It's so important for us to work together on the local level. I sit down with my counties, the local level, to find out what their priorities are with the state and the federal government level. So important for us to work together. So please help us learn. Like I said, I'm a small business owner in the healthcare sector. Help others learn about the water issues and the solutions that, I might not be around to see the end of, but have got to work on. And I'm not sure if we have more time for questions. We don't, so please interact with us. Thank you.